Hey everyone. This is going to be one of those videos talking about double action pistols versus, let's see where it is. Here we go. A striker fire pistol. Um, all of the guns that you're going to see here have been unloaded. Make sure that when you're handling firearms, especially in a situation like this that's not got a designated target, kind of that way, um, that you make sure that you're still practicing safe gun handling. So, that being said, I'm going to talk about double action pistols today. We have, this is a CZP-01. It's a really fantastic pistol. But this is a traditional double action, single action pistol. So you start, one of the telltale signs of one of these guys is you've got a hammer. You have a heavy double action pull. The gun cycles. You have a reset. And then it's a different trigger pull in single action. I'm mainly going to talk about my experience with double action pistols. This little CZ is one of the ones that was on my list from before I had even shot a pistol. So about a decade ago, about a decade and a half ago, before I had shot pistols at all, I had this guy. This is my Mossberg 500. It is probably one of the best guns that I've ever owned. It's fantastic. It has probably have 2,000 rounds through it, but it has a very simple trigger. It's got a safety right here and a pump action, just like any other pump action type shotgun. You have a single action trigger. So you do that, you cock the gun somehow, and then you have a single action trigger, and when you don't want to use it, you put a safety on. Double action pistols like this guy are a lot more complicated, and when I was looking at it online, it seemed like the best of all worlds. And I'm not going to knock double action pistols. A lot of people think they're fantastic. I'm one of those, but they do take a little more skill to master. They take a little more skill because you have that first double action pull. So this trigger's actually been tuned a little bit, but generally it's around 8 to 12 pounds thereabouts. The gun cycles, and now your trigger's in a different position as opposed to here. The trigger being in a different position, you have a lighter trigger pull, shorter take up. It's a little more difficult. Now, there's a couple of really good firearms instructors out there. One of those who spent a lot of time with double action pistols is a guy by the name of goes by the name of Greg Cruz. He's an instructor up at Smith & Wesson currently. I took a pistol shooting class with him, affiliated with On Target Training, where was it? Somewhere in Rhode Island, southern Rhode Island. And he's a really good pistol instructor. He's done a lot of work with the SIG 229, I believe, as a U.S. Air Marshal. And in it, I brought this guy, this CZ, to a class of ours. And it's a really good gun, but I was one of those guys who was firing a double action, and just like about everyone else there, I would go for my first shot, and I would miss. Then I would go to that nice light trigger pull, and I would hit the second and subsequent shots. And then it was time to put the gun away, so I was in single action mode. I'd decock, put the gun away, and then when it's time to draw again, I pull, and my first shot was low, and then I would shoot, and all the others after that were on target. And he would go to me and say, "Listen, take the first shot. No matter what you need to do, slow down and make that first shot, make it count, because double action is not an excuse for a miss." Paraphrasing, by the way, but it's not an excuse. Double action is not an excuse to miss. So it does take a little more work to get a double action going. All three pistol classes that I've taken, I've used a double action pistol. I used this guy. I used my HK45C, which is a fantastic gun, and my Walther P99 in those orders, all of which are double action, single action pistols. I've since started carrying, since about 2 years ago, started carrying this guy. This is the Glock 19C. You've seen this in a couple other videos that I have. This is a traditional striker fire pistol. So just like that shotgun that you guys saw, this, while it doesn't have a safety, has a single action. Technically the Glock has like a safe action where you pre-cock, a little bit, and then you finish the cocking by pulling the trigger the rest of the way. But the trigger pull is the same whether it's your first pull or your last pull. For the most part, it's a single action with a couple of asterisks associated with it. So in this case, you have the benefit of a single type of shot all the time. A couple of positives: it's less stuff to train, it's less stuff to work on. You pull this from a holster, your first shot is the same as your second, is the same as your 10th. And from my experience, it's a lot easier to get to learn. I shot double action pistols for quite a long time, and I moved to a single action, and the transition was very easy to go in that direction. Going to double action pistols takes a lot of time, a lot of effort, a lot of rounds, and you have to really practice two types of trigger pulls. So one of the detriments about the Glock is, now that I've pulled the trigger, let me show you. I pull the trigger, and now the gun's dead. If the round doesn't fire, I have to cycle the gun manually, which usually means getting a round out of the chamber, because it's got a bad primer or something, and then putting a new round in the chamber. Now I'm good to go. I can fire again. The gun has to cycle every time. There's a couple of things that can happen that primarily is bad primers, where you would have an issue with this. If the gun doesn't cycle, usually it's bad ammunition, and your best remedial action is to tap, rack. So what you do is you make sure the magazine's seated properly. If you know it's bad ammo, you don't have to do the tap, but it's good practice to do that anyway. You tap, you rack, and now you're good to go. Now you can fire. Now, one of the weird criticisms that I've heard, and I totally understand where it's coming from, but if you're in a fight and you're on the ground and you only have one hand, so normally if you're standing up, your tap would be like that, your rack would be off your belt, and I mean, that was like on top of a sweatshirt too. It's actually not that difficult. Just practice it with the plastic sights and everything. That's your rack, and then you can shoot. Sometimes you don't always have that ability, so you go like off the ground. If you're, say I'm lying on my back, off the ground, and whatever. You don't always have that ability. With a double action, if I've got a bad primer, every bad primer I've ever come across, there's been about 2 or 3 of them over like a couple, probably 10 or 15,000 rounds. You just pull the trigger again. It's okay. It's not a totally dead one. It's just a hard primer, so you just hit it again and you're fine. Double action, you can do that. You can pull the trigger as many times as you want. Now, I guess the response is, if you had bad ammo in here, and it was a time-sensitive thing, how long does that take? Really not long at all. The CZ is a little more difficult because you have to grab onto a tiny, tiny slide, or at least tiny space for the slide, but it's still not that bad. And actually, there's a video I'll roll in right here of me doing a remedial action on a case of bad ammo. In this video, I get the dead round, out of the chamber. I found it after the video. I put it back in the gun, and it fired just fine. So that's a case where I could have done one of those deals. Here we go.
Green, blue, red! That's really cool.
Now, the best of both worlds is really something like this. This is the HK45C, and this one is the same one I brought to my second pistol class, but this one's been converted to their LEM trigger. So you notice it's an LEM because it has a bobbed hammer. What happens here is it's kind of pre-cocked. I'm not going to do a video on the LEM specifically right now, but you have a light trigger pull. Let me do that again. You've got a lot of take up, and then you get to the back wall just like in a single action. Pull the trigger, and then you have a short reset, and everything's like a single action trigger, but the difference is the hammer is fully forward, so it's light. The only thing you're fighting is the trigger return spring right here. Then you get to the back end, the mainspring's already cocked, and then you cycle, and every round, no matter what, is a light single action type brake. There's a couple more mechanisms kind of working in the background on this. But one of the main benefits of this is if I pull the trigger and the round doesn't fire, that's if the round did fire, I apologize. If the round doesn't fire, you can still fire again. Now it's a much, much heavier pull this time. In normal fire, you would never see that. You would never see that heavier pull, but it still is an option for you if the gun doesn't cycle. Cycling just cocks the mainspring, and if it's not cocked, that's what you're doing with the trigger here. So it acts just like a double action kind of behind the scenes. Anyway, so it's a nice little pistol. This one does not have an external safety. It doesn't have any external levers because those have been removed. It's an LEM model. But this is a really good option too if you want that consistency without the detriment of striker fire. One other, I guess two other, so that's one benefit to a double action. Another benefit, people talk about the safety thing. I think that's a little kind of overblown because the safety is on me. As a shooter, the safety is on me not to put my trigger finger, or anything for that matter, in the trigger guard till I'm ready to fire. So they talk about, well, as you're drawing, you've got this. Let me grab the double action again. As you're drawing, you've got this heavy pull. So if you're under a lot of stress, the gun is less likely to accidentally go off. That's your fault. It's my fault as a shooter if that happens. Plain and simple. If that happens, my bad. And knowing that's a possibility, I need to train around that. I need to make sure that doesn't happen. So, in my personal opinion, both of these guys, the CZ and the Glock, are equally safe in that regard. But the one place where there's a little more benefit, in my opinion, to a hammer-fired pistol is if you're holstering the gun. You can get away with a little more with a hammer-fired pistol. What I mean by that is the gun cannot physically fire unless the hammer moves to the back of the travel and then gets released. If the hammer is, and by the way, the CZ has a half-cock position, so when you decock, that's where it's going. So when you see the hammer down all the way, and I just thumb it back a little bit, I'm moving it to the half-cock. I'm not moving it to the full cock. But when you're holstering the gun, now I carry appendix. When you go to put the gun away, you can put your thumb on top of the back of the hammer and just make sure it doesn't go back. If anything gets in the trigger guard, like I'm wearing a sweatshirt right now, if I'm pushing down, a clump of sweatshirt gets caught in there, and I push like an idiot, and I try to force it into the holster, I'll feel that hammer start to move back. And when I do, I can keep my thumb in there. I can push against that, and then I feel the resistance. I'm like, okay, I'll look down and make sure I can get what's going on. I'm not wearing a holster right now, by the way. The striker fire option, this guy, does not do that. There's no anything on the back of here. Even my Walther P99, which does have a little striker indicator, you can't put your finger on here, and you might be able to feel it if you're super tactile. But here, if something is caught in the trigger guard, the gun can fire, and you won't have any indication on your thumb, unless you're running a weird backplate doohickey thing. I don't know. I don't buy into that just yet. I need to see one of those in action. So as you're going to holster, let's go to holster just in my pants, like this. If something gets caught in there, the gun can fire here, and that's very bad for many reasons. So that's just a benefit of a double action pistol as opposed to a single. Now, the benefit for the single action or the striker fire comes on the other side. When you go to draw the gun, you get added performance, in my opinion, here. All these things kind of put together equate to a full system that really you have to try out. So if you have an opportunity, rent a double action pistol and rent a striker fire or single action pistol right next to each other. Now, if you really want to be an expert, and I do mean that, by the way, you can have something like this. This is 1911. This is it's not as complicated as a double action, but you do have the single action. You do have, once the gun fires, trigger's dead. It has to cycle just like a Glock. But you also have that safety in there that you have to worry about, and there's a grip safety, so you really have to make sure you get a good grip on the gun in order for it to fire. So if you really want to be an expert like that, something like this is an option for you. And this, again, when you're holstering, just like anything else, I would not holster this appendix, but if you're holstering this, same thing. You have to make sure you've got that safety on and the trigger's clear, because especially if you've got a grip on the pistol, that fires very easy, even easier than something like a Glock trigger. So keep an eye on that. And here, again, you can't thumb it because the hammer's already all the way back, so you're kind of stuck. So again, if you're going to do something like this, get the training you need, practice, and try holstering. Put a dummy round in there. Try holstering a couple times. Holster under stress. There's never a race to get back into the holster. You never have to holster your gun super quick. Even in a situation where you just shot someone and you have to administer medical care or something, maybe to the person, maybe to someone else, whatever the case is, if you're ever under a ton of stress and your hands are shaking, whatever, just put the gun down. If you need to, if it's that stressful of a moment, just put it down on the ground, pointing in a safe direction. Keep an eye on it. Make sure you keep control of it. But that's something you got to plan for if you're going to shoot. That's all I got. Anyway, guys and gals, stay safe out there, and just make sure you get a chance to try out various pistols before you make a purchase. If you do make a purchase, whether you've tried it or not, get the training you need and really deserve. Thanks.